Hello and welcome. Thank you for being here and investing your time in improving your English and yourself. There was a time when I sat in front of a foreigner and I knew I could understand what they were saying, but I just couldn't speak properly. At that moment, I had words in my head, I had some grammar, I even had an answer, but everything became messy, and in the end, I just smiled to hide it. That moment felt really uncomfortable because I knew I was not someone who knew nothing, but I still couldn't use what I had learned. On the way home, I kept thinking about one question. Why did I study so much but still couldn't speak? I started to doubt myself, thinking maybe I had no talent or maybe I was not as good as other people. But after some time, I realized something very simple. I was not bad. I was just learning in the wrong way. You are trying to learn English like it is a school subject, but it is actually not like that at all. At school, you are often told to start with grammar, to understand sentence structure, and to remember many rules before you can use the language. You may spend a lot of time learning tenses, memorizing forms, and doing exercises again and again. But in real life, people do not speak by thinking about grammar rules before they open their mouth. No one stops to think about the present perfect tense when they're having a normal conversation. They just speak because the words come to them naturally. You may have learned many structures before, and you may even remember them quite well. However, when you need to speak, you cannot put them together into a natural sentence. This can make you feel confused and frustrated because you know something but you cannot use it. The problem is not that you do not have knowledge, but that you are learning the wrong things for communication. Language does not work by rules stored in your head. It works more like a feeling that becomes stronger when you hear the language many times. When you listen a lot, you start to notice patterns without trying too hard. You begin to feel what sounds right and what sounds strange. This feeling helps you speak more naturally, without thinking too much. But most people ignore this important part because it is very different from how they learned in school. They still believe that more grammar means better speaking, even when it doesn't help them in real conversations. You may not remember how you learned to speak Vietnamese, but you know one thing: you did not learn it by writing notes or studying rules. When you were a child, you listened to thousands of sentences every day for many years before you could say your first full sentence. At that time, you did not understand everything, but you slowly became familiar with the sounds, the rhythm, and the way people used words. You heard the same patterns again and again in different situations, and your brain started to remember them without effort. Then, one day, you began to speak, not because you had studied enough, but because you had listened enough. Your first sentences were simple, but they came out naturally, without thinking too much. That is how language really enters your brain. It does not come from analysis or from trying to understand every rule. It comes from natural repetition, again and again, until it becomes a habit. Over time, you no longer need to think about each word, because everything feels familiar. But when you learn English, you often do the opposite. You try to speak before you are ready, before your brain has enough input to support you. You force yourself to create sentences, even when you are not comfortable with the language yet. Because of that, your speech feels slow, non-natural, and sometimes even stressful. You may stop often, think too much, and worry about making mistakes. This makes learning feel harder than it should be, and it takes away your confidence. You don't need to speak more, you need to listen more. Many people try to practice speaking every single day, but they still feel stuck when they want to talk. The reason is simple. They do not have enough input in their mind to support their speaking. It's like trying to write a good essay when you have not read enough books beforehand. You may know some words and some grammar, but you do not have enough ideas or examples to use. Because of that, you will often feel slow, confused, and unsure about what to say next. You may stop many times, think too much, and worry that your sentences are wrong. This makes speaking feel stressful instead of natural. But when you start listening more, everything begins to change slowly. You hear the same phrases again and again in different situations. At first, you may not notice them clearly, but your brain is still recording everything. After some time, these phrases become familiar and you start to recognize them easily. You do not need to force yourself to memorize them because they stay in your mind naturally. When you hear something many times, it becomes a part of your thinking. Then, little by little, your brain starts to connect these pieces together. You begin to form sentences without trying too hard. Words come to you more quickly, and your ideas become clearer. That is the moment when you stop translating in your head. You are no longer thinking in your first language and then changing it into English. Instead, you start to understand English directly, in a more natural way. And when that happens, speaking becomes easier, smoother, and more confident. You don't need to study 5 hours a day, you need to study every day. Many people study very hard for a few days, but then they stop for a few weeks. They feel motivated at the beginning, but they cannot keep that energy for a long time. Because of that, their learning becomes inconsistent and they don't see real progress. Language learning does not work like that because it needs time to build slowly. Every time you listen, you add a small piece of familiarity to your brain. Each small session may not feel important, but together they create real change. But every time you stop for too long, you break that process. Your brain starts to forget, and you need more time to get back to where you were. There is no big jump in language learning. There is only small progress that repeats again and again over time. Even just 30 minutes a day can be very powerful if you do it for many months. It may feel slow at first, but it builds a strong foundation step by step. This is much more effective than studying many hours in a short time and then stopping. Short daily practice helps your brain stay connected to the language. It keeps everything fresh and easier to remember. Over time, this steady habit makes learning feel more natural and less stressful. So the real question is not how much you study in one day. The real question is whether you can continue without stopping. You don't need to stop learning grammar, but you also don't need to start with it. Grammar is something you should not try to memorize from the beginning. It is something you begin to notice after you become familiar with the language. When you listen enough, you start to feel which sentences sound right and which sentences sound wrong. You may not know the name of the structure, but you can still feel the difference. This is called language intuition, and it is much stronger than just remembering rules. It helps you use the language naturally without stopping to think too much. You do not need to translate or check every sentence in your head. Instead, you respond more quickly, like in a real conversation. Of course, you can still learn grammar and it can be useful, but it is better to learn it later after you already have a good listening foundation. At that time, grammar becomes easier to understand. It no longer becomes something confusing or difficult to remember. It simply becomes a way to explain what you already know and feel. You connect the rules with real examples that you have heard many times. This makes grammar more meaningful and easier to use in real life. Instead of slowing you down, it supports your communication, and because of that, you feel more confident when using English. You don't need to force yourself to speak when you are not ready. Many people are afraid that if they do not practice speaking early, they will never be able to speak well. Because of that fear, they try to speak from the beginning, even when they still feel unsure. But in reality, speaking is the result of listening enough, not the starting point. When you listen a lot, you become familiar with how people really speak. You start to notice common phrases, simple patterns, and natural ways of expressing ideas. After some time, your brain begins to copy these patterns automatically. You do not need to push yourself too hard, because the words come more naturally. Sometimes you may say a sentence and feel surprised because you do not remember learning it before. That is a good sign that your brain is learning in the right way. It shows that the language is becoming a part of you, not just something you study. You cannot continue something if you do not enjoy it.
If you study with boring materials, you will always find reasons to delay or stop. You may tell yourself that you will study later, but later often never comes. Over time, learning becomes a task that you want to avoid. But when you watch a movie you like or listen to an interesting podcast, everything feels different. You are not thinking about studying, you are simply enjoying the content. At the same time, you are still listening to English and learning without pressure. The language becomes a natural part of your experience, not something separate. Because you enjoy it, you can spend more time without feeling tired. You stay longer, and that is what really helps you improve. Emotion plays a very important role in learning a language. It keeps you coming back again and again, even when you are busy. It makes the process feel lighter and more comfortable. This is much stronger than forcing yourself with strict discipline. Pressure may push you for a short time, but it cannot last long. Interest is what keeps you going for months and even years. When you enjoy the process, learning becomes easier and more natural, and that is when real progress starts to happen. You don't need a more complicated method. You need a more natural way of learning. Listen more, understand more, and be patient with your own process. Do not rush, because language is not something you can learn very fast. But if you follow the right direction, one day everything will start to click. You will listen and understand more easily. You will speak without thinking too much. And you will realize the problem was never your ability, it was just the way you learned before. If you find this video interesting and helpful, please give me a like and subscribe.